America's Cold War, Chapter 5, The Nuclear Rubicon, Part 8, the final part, by the way, to the brink over Cuba. Yet the outcome of the crisis left a bitter aftertaste in the mouths of Kennedy and his top aides. They had been forced to compromise over Berlin, and had precious little to show for their campaign promise to strengthen America's military capacity. Led by Secretary of Defense McNamara, the administration sought in '62 to overhaul U.S. security policy. McNamara, influenced heavily by civilian strategists such as Thomas Schelling, introduced the no cities nuclear doctrine in the summer of that year. No longer would the United States regard war with the Soviet Union as an occasion for total nuclear destruction. It would target Soviet military installations and missile sites, not Warsaw Pact cities, in the events of war. It would strengthen its conventional forces in Europe and elsewhere and prepare strategies of limited nuclear war. Should World War III begin, America would try to win it in a specific and carefully calibrated fashion, rather than by simply blowing up the planet. The idea is reasoned in elite opinion. Many congressional hawks, nuclear strategists, and arms manufacturers applauded the new direction. But how determined was the administration to follow through with this new policy? Kennedy would soon have his opportunity to test it. On Tuesday, October 16, 1962, the CIA reported that their U-2 surveillance aircraft had photographed Soviet missile installations in Cuba. Reports had already indicated that the Soviets might be up to something on the island, but now National Security Advisor Bundy told the president that there could be little doubt that Khrushchev was deploying medium-range nuclear missiles on the Caribbean island. Thus began the final and most dangerous of the 5 major Cold War nuclear crises between 1958 and 1962. Historians have long debated Khrushchev's reasons for taking this risky step. The evidence suggests he had several motives. He knew, first off, that Kennedy remained determined to overthrow Castro's government, now one of the USSR's most important allies. He may not have known just how determined, in the wake of the Bay of Pigs operation, Kennedy gave the go-ahead to a CIA project, Operation Mongoose, to disrupt the island's trade, support raids on Cuba from South Florida, and plot to kill Castro. Among the assassination schemes, providing Castro with poisoned cigars, and harpooning him while he was snorkeling at Caribbean resort. In recent months, the United States had tightened its economic blockade of the island and had undertaken provocative military maneuvers in the Caribbean. An American invasion seemed likely to both Khrushchev and Castro. By deploying nuclear weapons on Cuban soil, the Soviet Union would drastically raise the stakes of such an attack. Moreover, by siding with the Cuban government in such a dramatic fashion, Khrushchev could show that the Soviet Union was still committed to the cause of world socialism, that it had not become the conservative, risk-averse superpower many critics, especially in communist China, had portrayed it to be. The Sino-Soviet tensions had deteriorated sharply in recent years, and the two powers had now essentially split. Khrushchev did not want to give Castro any reason to drift towards Chinese patronage. He had also felt a powerful personal bond with Castro ever since the two men met briefly in Harlem in September 1960 during a UN General Assembly meeting, when the 6'4" Cuban bent down to embrace the 5'3" Russian in an exuberant bear hug. "He made a deep impression on me," Khrushchev later said. In due course, he would come to love Castro like a son. But the most important motive was surely a more conventional one. Khrushchev hoped by the deployment to rectify the balance of power. As Alexander Fursenko and Timothy Naftali have demonstrated, the Soviet leader was determined to redress, when and where he could, the minor victories the United States had won during its period of nuclear superiority. The USSR had not yet reached parity with the Americans in terms of long-range rockets and planes, so-called strategic weapons. He knew, but it had plenty of medium-range ballistic missiles, MRBMs, targeted on Western Europe. By moving some of these to territory 90 miles from Florida, he could give the Americans a taste of their own medicine. The United States, after all, had allies encircling the Soviet Union. Its nuclear missiles were deployed in Turkey, West Germany, and other European states not far from Russian borders, and the Western powers retained a foothold in Berlin. A Soviet missile base in Cuba seemed only fair. Some American officials agreed, at least to a point. Robert McNamara, for one, initially asked colleagues what difference it made to the larger strategic picture if the Soviets had missiles in Cuba. Would it change the balance of nuclear terror? McNamara thought not, though the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the JCs, disagreed. Kennedy's focus, though, was elsewhere. He had suffered a humiliating setback at the Bay of Pigs and had got the worst of the Vienna encounter with Khrushchev. In Berlin, he had accepted the wall, rightly in his own mind, but to the distress of right-wing figures in Congress and the press, who saw it as an obvious casus belli, whatever that means. For Kennedy, geopolitical fairness was not an issue. His and his country's reputation was on the line. If he did nothing about the Soviet provocation, Khrushchev would have every reason to conclude that he could peck away at American positions, confident that the administration would always back down. And Kennedy would face withering attacks from Republicans and conservative Democrats, with midterm elections only a couple weeks away. Already in September, conservatives had accused the White House of underplaying growing evidence of a Soviet arms buildup in Cuba, causing Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield of Montana to express fear to JFK that if public pressures on Democratic members now begin to lead them to engage in an attempt to outdo Republicans in militancy in Cuba, I'm concerned as to where it might end. Democrats up for re-election might have to leave you on this matter, Mansfield warned. On October 7th, 9 days before the U-2 discovery, Mansfield GOP counterpart, Minority Leader Everett Dirksen of Illinois, announced that Kennedy had a sorry record on Cuba. There was a mess in Cuba, Dirksen charged, a mess of America's own making. And on October 16th, mere hours before the discovery, the chairman of the Republican National Committee issued a statement condemning JFK's foreign policy and calling Cuba in particular a symbol of tragic irresolution of the administration. A symbol of the tragic irresolution of the administration. The political pressure on Kennedy was enormous. He convened an executive committee of the National Security Council, later called XCOM, to advise him on the proper response. Initially, Kennedy, along with his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, considered authorizing a surgical airstrike to take out the missile installations unilaterally, in part to give hawks the feeling that their views received due consideration. And when we say hawks, we mean like politicians who want people to go to war but wouldn't fight themselves. But General Maxwell Taylor, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, could not promise that such a strike would disable every missile the U-2s had spotted, and there was no guarantee that the Soviets had not deployed other missiles the spy planes had missed, which, as it turned out, they had. A single nuclear missile that survived the attack could destroy an American city in the southeast, such as Miami or Atlanta. On Wednesday, October 18th, Taylor stressed that even a major air attack on Cuba would probably not destroy every missile, and even if it did, the Soviets might respond to such an attack by beginning a general nuclear war. Still, at the end of the day, an airstrike remained one of the two main options under XCOM consideration, the other being a naval blockade. By the evening of Saturday, October 20th, Kennedy, supported by his brother and McNamara, had made a tentative decision in favor of the blockade. More than many of those around him, JFK had a sense of the vagaries of history, the tendency for things to happen differently from what you intended. Earlier in the year, he had read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, which detailed how European leaders stumbled into World War I. He came away so impressed that he often quoted from the book and urged aides as well as every officer in the army to read it. Considering the stakes and the possibility of nuclear war, the blockade seemed to him the safer option, and it would not put the United States in the morally dubious position of launching a surprise preventative attack, which is exactly what the Japanese had done at Pearl Harbor. A blockade could prevent the Soviet Union from increasing its deployment of missiles on the island and could create a more stable situation for negotiations to occur, without giving the appearance of the Soviets of being a military escalation. It could also deprive the Kremlin of an excuse to retaliate by moving militarily on Berlin. The president polled the group, and the supporters of the blockade prevailed. For the time being, there would be no U.S. attack. By October 22nd, the general plan was set. The United States Navy would establish a blockade around Cuba, using the less aggressive word of quarantine, while the president would demand publicly that the Soviet Union dismantle their missiles and take them home. At the same time, the idea of a trade with the Kremlin would be secretly floated. The United States would remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey if the Soviet removed its missiles from Cuba. That evening, the president went before a national and world television audience and announced the naval quarantine, demanded the removal of missiles from Cuba, and warned that if any of the weapons were launched against any target in the Western Hemisphere, he would order a full U.S. response against the USSR itself. It would be massive retaliation, not flexible response. The European allies declared their support for the blockade, as did the Organization of American States. The Strategic Air Command went to its highest airborne alert. 1 in every 8 strategic bombers was to be airborne at all times, to guarantee that some survived in the event of a Soviet airstrike. Around the world, especially in North America and Europe, people began to think the unthinkable. A nuclear war might erupt at any moment. Would anyone be alive come morning? Would it be better to die instantly, or to try to survive somehow? Nuclear war had been a persistent possibility during the previous crises, but never before had the two superpowers found themselves in a showdown like this. As far as anyone on the outside could see, one side would have to back down, and soon, or there would be war. Throughout the United States, men and women planned for the worst. Some moved their families into private bomb shelters, stocking them with rations, fresh water, and weaponry, in order to keep neighbors out. Others hastily made arrangements to emigrate to Australia or New Zealand. In Memphis, Tennessee, police discovered a man standing over a manhole in the middle of the night, trying to determine if his family could escape through it. Other Americans used mordant wit to keep a level head. Mocking his university's pointless system of warning signals, a student at the University of California concluded, The air raid siren is preceded by a bright flash. Obviously referring to a nuke if you're stupid. People had reason to fear that their world was about to come to an end, more so than they could have known at the time. Khrushchev's initial reply to the Kennedy speech, a note that arrived in Washington early on the morning of the 23rd, took a firm line. The blockade was in violation of international law. The missiles were there for defensive purposes. The USSR would not back down. The moment had arrived for confrontation and war. Instead, over the final 6 days of the crisis, the Kennedy administration determined that it would pursue peace and developed a brilliant strategy to achieve it. Robert Kennedy met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to finalize the deal on the missiles in Turkey, and U.S. officials prepared to take the case to the United Nations and to ask Secretary General U Thant to intervene in the crisis. Meanwhile, the administration kept the blockade in place, along with its demand that the missiles be dismantled and removed. And then it waited. On October 26, Khrushchev took one step backwards. Secretly, he sent a letter to Kennedy declaring that any further ships traveling to Cuba would not carry missiles. If the United States were to promise that it would never invade Cuba or support any sort of forces that might do so, then the necessity for the presence of our military specialists in Cuba would disappear. Was Khrushchev promising to withdraw the missiles? This letter implied as much, but it was vague. The next morning, Khrushchev sent another, less conciliatory letter, stating simply that the Soviets would remove its rockets from Cuba if the Americans took the Jupiters out of Turkey. This was a blow to Kennedy, because he wanted to avoid a public deal that might demoralize allies in Europe and bring accusations of appeasement at home, and also because Khrushchev seemed to be raining on the offer. Oh, I don't know that word. To be reneging. Reneging? On the offer he had made just the day before. Was the Soviet leader once again trying to manipulate Kennedy? That afternoon, news arrived that a U-2 had been shot down over Cuba. Had Kennedy been even somewhat inclined to return to the military option, to reject diplomacy, this was the time for that to happen. He would have had a strong public backing, and with midterm elections only a few days away. Instead, he ramped up his diplomatic efforts. He would not lose this opportunity to strike a reasonable deal with Moscow and avoid a nuclear war, even as several of his advisors, including McNamara, were reviving talk of military action. Kennedy sent his brother to confirm to Dobrynin that the United States would in fact dismantle the missiles in Turkey within 4 to 5 months, as long as this could be done covertly and not part of a public deal. The promises never to invade Cuba, however, would be made public. In exchange, the USSR would agree to dismantle its nuclear missiles under supervision, take them home, and not deploy them on Cuban soil ever again. At the same time, the White House formally replied to Khrushchev's October 26 letter, promising simply not to invade Cuba, and acted as though his second letter had not been received. This trollop ploy, in reference to a favorite plot device of the 19th century British novelist Anthony Trollope, put the Soviet leader in the awkward position of having to insist that the Americans ignore the first letter, even as he knew privately the Americans were offering to get rid of the Turkish missiles as he demanded in the second. At 9 a.m., Washington time, on Sunday, October 28th, Khrushchev announced on Radio Moscow that it would terminate its deployment of missiles on Cuban soil. Kennedy ordered the CIA to halt Operation Mongoose, the ongoing attempt to undermine the Castro regime. Soviet officials began to dismantle the medium-range missiles in Cuba and put them on ships bound for Russia. The Cuban Missile Crisis was effectively over. Little afterword here. We're done now, but don't leave. This leads into page 208. On the board, Rabel wrote 207 was the limit, but this ends the section, so I read to 208. Anyways. End of chapter 5.